Hello, everyone. I am going to focus in this recording on the intellectual, artistic, cultural background for the symposium. These are slides from the lecture that I won't have a chance to go over on for our next class. For our next class, we really want to jump right into the symposium. So I want to give you a bit of a background to the Greeks, to their culture, look at a little bit of art. I'm going to keep this lecture down to around 20 minutes. And if I need to follow up with it, then I'll record another lecture giving a bit more detail. A subsequent lecture or recording will deal with the Greek religion, look at the Greek gods a little bit, and much of this you probably already know. We won't go really deep into the Greek gods, a little bit of a superficial analysis of them. So let's get started here. First of all, I want to focus on this idea of the rational Western civilization and remind you from our first lecture last week that the concept of rationality is deeply structurally related to masculinity in civilization, especially agrarian civilization. So this notion of a rational Western civilization is a bit loaded, and it does imply that this is a patriarchal civilization, or that patriarchy is defined by the members of this civilization, these civilizations, as we move forward, as being inherently rational, defining the terms, really, of what it means to be rational. So the first question would normally have been a little bit of a quiz for you to guess where Greece is. I'll skip past that and skip past this one as well. You can see it. To talk a little bit about this concept, immortality. You can read more of this on your own once you have access to Top Hat, and I encourage you to read it. It is pretty straightforward. There is a section here that mentions the relationship between the people and Hades. So the concept of death, especially as you see it in the Iliad, the concept of death is that after the body is dead, the soul, the spirit, descends into the realm of Hades. And there are various myths about how that process happens, including crossing a certain river, the river Styx, drinking from the river, so you begin to forget your life. You forget most of the details of your life. But then you live in the realm of Hades as a shade, as a shadow. Slowly fading away, because your existence is determined by the people who remember you. So if you are a farmer in the field and you have a lot of children, then those children are going to remember you, and then they may have an image of you or stories about you that they will pass on to their own children. And so these stories about the ancestors that were told by the Greek peoples, but also by the people throughout Mesopotamia, these stories were not just stories. They weren't just moral stories. They weren't just narrative, fictional narrative. They were stories that were intended to carry forward the name of the ancestor so that the ancestor would be remembered. There are also, of course, a lot of superstitions that are related to this, having to remember the ancestors so that they don't punish you in some way. A very similar concept can be found in the Egyptian world, and except that the descendants are not asked to remember the ancestors. The ancestors themselves remember their life by being in the tomb that they have, with all of the paintings around them, all of the information about their life in that tomb. So there is this relationship, a deep structural relationship between memory and the concept of death. For the Greeks, this means that you are supposed to be remembered in order to be preserved in the afterlife. For heroes, the poet is the person who preserves their name, or is one of the people, the primary person who preserves their name. So these characters that you may have read, if you have read the Iliad, you may have remembered from the Iliad characters such as Achilles, not Homer, he's the writer of the Iliad, Hector, Priam, and others are remembered, and therefore they persist in the afterlife. They still exist down there because we are in the process of reading their names. So every time you read the name of Achilles, he continues to live down in the realm of Hades. So that is effectively what this is describing here. There's a variation, and it's important to remember at this point that the Greeks, and for everything that we talk about with the Greeks were not a homogeneous group of people, all of whom believed exactly the same thing, or even spoke the same language. The Greeks were a heterogeneous group of people, as any other culture or civilization is, with a lot of different beliefs about the afterlife, about the gods, about human beings. And one other version is the Pythagorean version of what happens to the soul. It doesn't really concern us that much, except in this notion that there's an alternative. The Symposium does not really put together the alternative, but Platonic thought seems to embrace an alternative to this concept of the spirit descending into the realm of Hades. It's not the core idea of the Symposium, but you should think that, or you should be mindful that Plato does seem to eventually, at any rate, believe that the soul may, instead of descending into the realm of Hades, ascend into a realm of perfection, perfect forms, ideals, etc., but only through the work of philosophical thought. That's the only way that the soul could ascend in that way, seemingly. So, skip this question as well. There's an image here of Athens. I'll skip past this. This is a line from the Iliad. I just mentioned that one of the purposes of the Symposium, one of the purposes of the poet in writing something like the Iliad is to preserve the names of the people who are fighting on the field of battle. I want to point out here, fairly briefly, that the characters that we see here are not exclusively Greek characters. So Homer, even though he was a Greek poet, was engaged in the process of preserving the names of the enemy as well as the Greeks. So Echepolis, or Echepolis, is a Trojan. And so by writing his name down, by memorializing him, Homer has preserved his memory in the same way that he has preserved the memory of Antilochus, the Greek here. And he has preserved the memory of Elphenor, another of the Greeks. You'll also see that there's this process after the death of the soldier, and this is recounted over and over and over again in the Iliad. And that process is to grab the body of the dead soldier, the dead warrior, pull them off the field of battle, and take their stuff. This was one of the rewards that the Greek warriors received. It's one of the awards they were promised if they volunteered to go along with Agamemnon to fight the Trojans. They knew that they would get goods, that they would get stuff. This is one of the ways of getting stuff. There's another undercurrent meaning here too, and that is that this warrior culture is one that focuses in and of itself on memorialization, or one aspect of it focuses on memorialization. So even the Elphenor here, the Abantes captain, is, when he pulls the body out of the field of battle and he takes the armor from him, he is memorializing the dead Echepolus, because he will take that armor back to his home and recount stories about Echepolus and how he was there when he fell. That armor will pass on from generation to generation, and so that's another vector for the preservation of the memory of these great warriors. But Homer focused on preserving the names of both the Trojans and the Greeks. Not every single human being gets their name recorded, but most do. Implies or suggests to us this culture, this warrior culture, was more than just a nationalistic culture. It extended into the it was a culture in and of itself. So it wasn't just the Greek warriors who were important. It was all warriors were sort of a band of brothers, to put it in kind of a modern way. Now, what does this have to do with the symposium in Plato? There is a mention in Plato of Socrates' own military prowess. Socrates was part of the military. There's another band of soldiers that's mentioned as well by one of the speakers, Phaedrus. So warrior culture and the respect that one had for warriors was deeply was a part of the Greek culture. It was part of the Athenian culture. But this emphasis on immortality is really the important component here, because if you have already finished the symposium, and if you haven't, then as you finish the symposium, you will recognize that the symposium is focused on this concept of immortality. It is creating another type of pathway towards a not full immortality, but a type of immortality. In that memorialization in the symposium works a bit different, but you'll see that as you read further. And this is, to some extent, what I just mentioned. I'll allow you to read that on your own. I want to shift now into some art. So the importance of memorialization, the importance of remembering one's ancestors, we see that already. This is not, at the beginning of Greek art, this is not necessarily a concept of memorialization, because these people who are the kouroi they're not named. We don't know if they were real people, if they're real individuals, or if this is just emerging from the imagination of the artist. There seems to be quite a bit of imaginary sort of idealism in these characters. There are a number of them, so this is one of several hundred that have been discovered. They're not all identical. Some of them are much more Egyptian-like, and others are fairly abstract. They have a lot of similarities. The stiffness of the body, 1 foot forward, tends to be very common. Definitely no naturalistic weight shift is another common component. So if you look at his shoulders, how stiff and straight they are, that's mirrored in how his hips are stiff and straight, in spite of the fact that he does have 1 foot forward. So if you, in your own home, you stand up and you stretch one leg forward a little bit, you'll notice that your hips tilt slightly. And that's because they have to. You've changed the distance between your hips and the floor, and so your hips will tilt in order to accommodate that. The artist here just simply have effectively one leg is longer than the other one. They're not attempting to create some sort of biological, naturalistic vision here. They are borrowing significantly from Egyptian art, and I'll allow you to explore a little bit of Egyptian statuary, and you'll see that these straight lines here in the lower part of the leg, those are very Egyptian. They're almost geometrical. The stiff shoulders, the arms down on the side, the hair, all of that is very derivative of Egyptian statuary. Frontally oriented is another Egyptian concept. Now, I should say that the Mesopotamian world generally doesn't have full freestanding statues. They use sort of a haute relief concept where the image is attached to a rock wall behind it. The Greeks and the Egyptians create statues that are freestanding. And all of these statues are very frontally oriented. They're intended to be viewed from the front. That doesn't mean that they don't have detail in the back, but everything is really oriented towards you looking at the image from the front. It was probably standing in front of a wall. A very rigid posture, and the wig-like hair. Now, one significant difference between this image and the Egyptian works that you can use as a parallel, which, by the way, most of those Egyptian statues are 2,000 years older than this one. The difference is that the Egyptian statuary is clothed. So the men in Egyptian statues have a loincloth. Now their chest is exposed, but you can't see their genitalia. Whereas, quite obviously, for this particular kouros, and this is common for every single one of them, you can see their genitals. And so the artist sets out with the notion of representing the nude body. The nude body is an important artistic feature of the Greek world. Now, if we compare this one to another statue, the Kore, these are statues of women. You'll notice that the difference is that these women are completely clothed. And in fact, in Greek statuary and in Greek painting generally, women are clothed. Now, the exceptions are those images that you see in the Reign of the Phallus, if you've read that already. You'll see a lot of paintings of women in the nude because they are, of course, prostitutes. We don't have any representations in freestanding statue from the Greek world that show women in the nude, except for one statue of Aphrodite. That doesn't mean that there weren't others, but mostly women are represented clothed. Mostly, if not exclusively. Whereas, mostly, if not exclusively, men are represented in the nude. As with the Christian boy. This nudity is definitely a new concept. It is, first of all, the concept of humanism. As you noted on that slide previously, I had nudity and humanism. The human body is being represented as divinely beautiful. That's a new thing. No other culture has thought of the human body as being beautiful. The Greeks, they begin to see that. They begin to change art so that you have a more naturalistic body. So if you'll notice, his hips here are tilted, as your hips will tilt if you rest your weight on one leg and you relax the other one. Your hips tilt in one direction. That's what we see here. So there's an attempt at a naturalistic body. The square shoulders still goes back to that kouros time. Very much a frontal orientation. That's still there. And as with the kouros, there is a high level of proportion, of perfect proportion, in other words, the body here is idealistically formed. If you split him right down the middle, he would be identical on either side. And that's not the way real human beings are. So and that includes his face. His face in that sort of abstract perfection there is symmetrical. That's what goes back to this period of the Kouros, this sense of an idealistically beautiful image, a human being that could not exist in the real world in its perfection and its symmetry. But because this is exclusively men represented in the nude, then you get an image, you get an idea of the Greek world and its concept of beauty as being the male body. The male body is an image of beauty for the Greeks, whereas the female body is an image of frailty and incompletion. The Christian boy, with his hips and his square shoulders and his idealism, is the beginning of a movement called the classical, or oftentimes called the Hellenic age. And that period is an Athenian period. So this is happening in Plato's city. It's happening around him. It does eventually spread to other colonies, Greek colonies, and it is very influential in the world after the end of Athens and its democracy, as it transitions into what's called the Hellenistic period, where the art is a bit different, but still focusing on this attempt to create a naturalistic form. So while it looks more realistic than the images that we've seen, it is, in fact, a better term is idealism, because as I've mentioned, he's so symmetrical, he is so perfect, he can't really exist in the world. And I will allow you to do that on your own. Now, he also is a symbol, representative, not much of a symbol, I don't suppose, but he's representative of another movement that's happening in the Greek world, and that is called rationalism. The Greeks, especially the Athenians, are beginning to look at the world around them as controlled by rational forces that are predictable. They're complicated, but there's a predictability to them. The natural world is not random, it is causal. And that doesn't leave much room for the gods to work miracles and things like that. So there's the beginning of a kind of a separation of the gods and the people, even though the people do see themselves as still dedicated to their gods. They still worship them. The Athenians still have a number of festivals that are dedicated to worshiping the gods. The entirety of the Parthenon and the Acropolis is dedicated to worshiping Athena, and they don't slack on that. However, they see themselves as understanding the world as not controlled by the gods, but is controlled by causal relationships, as controlled by physics and chemistry and etc. And they're beginning to explore the world in that way, in a scientific fashion. Now, how this works up into art and even into someone like Plato is that there is an emphasis on something called sophrosine, a notion of balance, order, symmetry, moderation, proper proportion, which is an idealistic term. It's a term of perfection for the Greeks. And someone like Socrates would be seen, you should view his philosophy as approaching some sort of sophrosine, seeking a balance, seeking order, seeking symmetry. So, other things that are going on around Mr. Plato are is of course the rise of what's called political humanism, and I'll let you know what that is. That is democracy. If humanism is the notion that human beings are important and beautiful and meaningful and kind of in control of things, then political humanism means that human beings are capable of managing their own affairs without relying on the gods to make decisions. And so a priestly class is not needed to make decisions in a democracy. And that's the democracy that forms, is a democracy that separates itself off from any sort of priestly class or priestly influence. It doesn't mean that they don't seek influence from the gods. They don't ask for it. They don't sacrifice to the gods so that their battles will go well, etc. But they believe strongly that they can run their own affairs on a day-to-day basis, on an international basis as well. And they do. So the democracy, however, does not survive very long. When Socrates is giving his speech, it's still around. When Plato is writing this down, however, it is, well, I think it's actually in its second phase when Plato is writing the Symposium. Plato himself was not a fan of democracy. And you can see that in Socrates' thought in the Republic, that effectively excellent people, professional politicians whose lives are dedicated to it, should be running the country according to them, should be running the city-state, not your average everyday person. Now that political mode doesn't come forward very much in the Symposium, so I think we can put that to the side. But keep in mind that Plato and Socrates eventually too, Socrates lived before Plato, by the way, that Socrates eventually, well, he seemingly was not a fan of democracy. We only have Plato's opinion of that, of course, because Socrates did not write anything down. The Athenian democracy, as with many democracies up until the 20th century, was only nominally a democracy. And I will talk more about that in a subsequent lecture. I think I'm going to go ahead and take a pause here, and I'll pick this up in a subsequent video. I hope you've enjoyed this little portion